This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
You know, Jason, I've been following you for a long time. 10 years ago is when I first saw your course, and I've been investing, gone to several Meet the Masters. And man, I'm telling you, the way that things have played out are way better than you projected for me personally. Obviously, it's been, a good 6 years, but now I'm ready to kick it into high gear as, I want to really build a portfolio that's, 4 or 5 times what I have already. My wife and I have 12 properties, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk here.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
We have got a thought-provoking 10th episode show for you today. Our guest is an industrial anthropologist. Really, he's a lot of things. I think you're going to find this to be a thought-provoking, if not controversial show today. So we will get into that in just a moment, but it is a 10th show, so we discuss a non-financial topic, and we'll have that in just a moment for you. But first, something quick that I thought would be interesting. A couple of charts from the Wall Street Journal, an article they published about the absolute death of the resale housing market. No, that's not their title, and it's not absolute. Nothing's absolute, but there is largely a death of the resale housing market. And why is that? Of course, you know the answer. It's because nobody wants to sell their home. Their mortgages are just too darn good a deal. And if we see another Fed rate hike, that will literally make those mortgages even more valuable. Remember, the unaware people who don't listen to the show, who don't get it, they think that higher mortgage rates hurt the housing market. And while that simplistic thinking is normally true, they actually create an additional pressure on the lock-in effect. The higher mortgage rates go, the more valuable all of the existing low-rate mortgages are. Right? Think about that. If we've got 25% of the country with existing mortgages with 28 years left on them, at or below 3%, 65% of the country with 28 years left on a mortgage at or below 4%, the higher mortgage rates go, the more valuable those existing mortgages become. Why would anybody want to sell that mortgage asset? And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing it play out just as yours truly predicted way back in 2020. I predicted all of this, and it is coming true. And if you don't believe me, just go back and listen to the old episodes. You'll hear me talk about this. And by golly, here it is. It came true. And go back and look at some other media, and you didn't hear anybody else talking about it back then. It all came from here. So glad you're listening, so you are in the know. So if you're watching on video, these two charts are very telling. If not, I will endeavor to explain them to you. This is NAR, National Association of Realtors data on the first chart, and it basically shows you back to the early 80s. It shows you the new single-family homes, in other words, the new construction, as a share of overall home sales. And so what this is showing us is that the new home market is really the only market, in essence, to speak of, right? Usually this is just a small share of maybe 10, maybe 15% of the overall market of transactions. But now it is at 35%. That is a meteoric rise, and the developers are loving it. Their stocks have climbed through the ceiling when everybody thought that would be the opposite. And by the way, I also predicted that last year. Sadly, I did not follow my own advice, which is not that uncommon. We are all our own worst enemy at times, and I am no exception to that rule, sadly. But anyway, I did predict that, and I talked to a bunch of my friends about these home builder stocks being unfairly beat up with higher rates, and I said, look, I live this every day. I know there is a massive housing shortage in the United States, and it is not going to get cured easily at all. And that is good for new home builders, especially lower priced entry-level new home builders. And by golly, of course, their stock went through the roof. I should have bought it. I didn't. I'm not much of a stock market guy, but occasionally I have an idea, and that was one of them that sadly I didn't act on. But we see a huge share of the market in the new home market now. Okay, well, what about housing starts? How many new homes are being started? How many are they going to build? What kind of supply will hit the market? Will it solve the problem? And the answer is no, it will not solve the problem. It will not even come close. It's a drop in the bucket, okay? Because remember, the average price of a new home is, number one, it's $475,000. Certainly that's above anybody's consideration of entry level, all right? But also, when we look at compared to what, and we go back over the last 23 years on this other chart, we see that there was a very low point, and that was due to the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, where we saw home building virtually stop, just completely stop. And then slowly, we saw it come back. It took over a decade, and now it has come back a bit. But still, it's nothing compared to where it used to be. And the demographics put more pressure on this market than they did in the past. Because think about the demographic trend we had, if you look at this chart, going into the Great Recession. Think about the demographic trend we had, in 2005, for example. We had, so that was 18 years ago, we had a small demographic cohort, my demographic cohort, the Gen X generation, only about 46 million of us, half the size of the baby boomers, half the size of the millennials, the sort of lost sandwich generation in between of latchkey kids that definitely did not have helicopter parents, the complete opposite of the millennials, by the way, and the Gen Zers. And these people were a small group coming into the housing market. And, they had an impact. Sure, there were 46 million of them, but in terms of the demand for housing, dramatically lower than that demand for housing today. So we have a double problem now, or a double opportunity, depending on which side of the fence you're on, right? The problem we have for buyers is that there's a lot of demand and there's a huge housing shortage. We only have about 35, maybe 40% of the housing inventory we need. And we have much higher demand because we have a generation hitting their household formation years that is double the size of the last generation. This is a big problem, folks. And it's a problem you can help solve as a real estate investor. And that's what we help you do on this show so that you are in a better financial position for your future. Now, it's a 10th show today, so we're not going to talk a lot about money and personal finance, but this interview is super interesting and controversial. So we'll have that in just a moment. But next week, I'm going to show you some amazing data that is going to show you the rent versus buy analysis in several markets around the country. This is new data. It is fascinating. I was just mulling over it this morning, and you got to see it. So next week, we're going to have that. But today, we've got our 10th episode show. Friday, we've got our flashback show where you can hear how my predictions have come true so many times, and that's coming up for you as well. And then next week, we're going to do some really interesting data. So let's get into our 10th episode guest right now. It is my pleasure to welcome Daniel McKinley. He was referred to the show by Rudyard Lynch, who is What If Alternate History. We've had him on the show. And if you joined us for our Scottsdale, Arizona conference, Empowered Investor Live, you met Rudyard there. It's just great to have Daniel on the show. He is an industrial anthropologist and a neuroscientist who has developed some very innovative ways to understand people and understand cultures and how this impacts economics and progress in general. So I'm really excited about getting into this. Daniel, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Jason. It's a real pleasure.
Good to have you. And you're coming to us from just south of me. You're in Aventura, Florida, which is the Miami area. We are almost neighbors. Tell us a little bit about the overview, the elevator pitch as to what it is you do and why it's meaningful.
The overview of what I do is I analyze psychological and sociological traits in a quantifiable way and measure how that can impact people's lives, their purchasing behaviors, and their businesses, and how it actually boils down to their relationships with other people. And that includes both their personal relationships and their working professional relationships.
I'm thinking you take this as far, and I'm just remembering this from some of the stuff that Rudyard Lynch said to me, as far as the way, societies organize themselves and social hierarchies and everything, right?
Exactly. So over the past 60, 70 years, anthropologists have come up with different traits called cultural dimensions. And I've been able to discover over 80 different cultural dimensions when it comes to how people organize themselves, how people see themselves, and how people work with each other. One of the most famous ones that most Americans have been talking about, who are very educated about economics lately, is collectivism versus individualism. So if someone scores high on collectivism, it means they view themselves less as individual, more as a collective, meaning that we should do things more tribalistically, more synergistically, more as a group, and there is less of the personal identity. On the opposite side, if you're more individualistic, you're more focused on personal responsibility, doing things your own particular way, and seeing society as a group of individuals that have their own free agency or choice, as opposed to the collective deciding for them. So, and there's many, many other traits when it deals to how people see themselves, how people communicate, what people value in terms of their life, their family, in terms of the choices they make individually. And so this is something that I'm very, very passionate about, because not many people look very much at culture. Culture is a big buzzword when it comes to a lot of corporations. And, there's a big talk about like ESG or DEI, but in many ways, it's kind of like saying, oh, well, we have culture at our company. Like we have foosball tables and we have like casual Friday and we have Taco Tuesday. And in reality, they have no idea what culture means. And they're not really able to ascertain it or view it from any kind of objective lens because they're not actually measuring it. So what I do as industrial anthropologist is I go into companies, they take a series of different assessments. First, they take an assessment dealing with their own personal cultures, and then I look at all of those results in aggregate to see how it fits on an organizational level, and then I do further analysis in terms of people's skills, their temperament, and their neurology.
Yeah, very interesting. And you also go into language. And one of the things we talked about before we started today is how the language has morphed and changed over the years and how that influences individuals and society in general. And it has happened so quickly. One of the things I'm always saying on the show is you must watch old movies, watch old TV shows, read old books, and listen to old music. And, especially if you look at it in the vein of music, I mean, every decade brings sort of a different flavor of music, of course, right? Personally, I may sound like a total nerd, but I love singer-songwriters from the 70s, especially, right? And it is shocking to me the way the lyrics of music have become just so base and frankly ugly.
Compare Yummy by Justin Bieber to Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah, it's absolutely really, really shocking. So tell us how the language influences us and our culture in general. And if you can tie that into what it means for economics and investing, I'm sure we'd love to hear that because we have a very financially minded audience.
So I'm going to be able to tie it all in. So very, very high level, what we consider to be reality is in many ways bounded by language. So what our reality speaking English is very different from the reality of someone who speaks a language that's completely untethered or untouched by Greco-Roman sources. So in the Arabic world, they're thinking a different way. In the Sinosphere, so like in Chinese, they're thinking in a completely different way. In India, because they're using Sanskrit-based languages, they're thinking in a completely different way. And that changes ultimately how their economies function and organize themselves. So on a much more basic level, language can be used to count specific words. I'm a fan of an academic by the name of James Pennebaker, and he's at the very forefront of a field known as computational linguistics. That is where you're able to count certain types of words, and it implies something about the psychology or attitudes or behaviors of a specific individual. So how many times you use words that are subconscious, that you don't really think about? Words like to, could, should, he, like, that, who. These are very basic words that we use all the time, and we're not really thinking about it because they're so basic. But you could actually, what I've done is created algorithms that can predict, okay, using such and such words is actually going to predict certain values in a society. And this is something that's very clear is often we just get a hunch like, oh, this person probably has this kind of like political views, or this person likely has this kind of social status. And for example, people of higher social status use the word we more and use the word I less. People of a lower social status use the word we less and use the word I more. So you could actually predict people's economic decisions based off the language they're using. I've been able to even predict, whether or not people are going to get into bankruptcy or they're going to default on their home within the next 6 months based off the language they're using right now. So this is combining, new linguistic algorithms and, some old psychology and science, all that actually has roots that go all the way back 175, 180 years, and combining it together. And I believe it has extraordinary economic implications.
It sure does, but give us maybe some examples and kind of prove that up for us a little bit, if you would. Maybe start with the I versus we. One of the criticisms of Obama, there were many, but was that he used the word I all the time. Like people would analyze his speeches and he kept saying I.
Yeah, a lot of people say it's narcissistic because of that way.
Yeah.
So you could look at, just say the word I. If you use the word I a normal amount, it doesn't really mean much. It means if you use any word in average amount, it implies you're a normal person in that specific regard of what you're looking for. But if you use the word I a little bit more than average, it means you're probably going to be narcissistic. If you use actually the word I less than average, it means you're inherently more of a high status person. If you use the word I very, very little, it means you're actually a very mentally healthy and you're very selfless and you're actually someone who's very mentally, okay and very competent. If you use the word I a lot, like much higher than more than one standard deviation higher, it means you're probably going to have some mental health issues. You're probably going to be more depressed. If you use the word I maybe 3 standard deviations higher than the average mean, then it likely means you're suicidal.
Fascinating.
So any word like that, and it's going to mean, different algorithms have, big data has figured out that it means something. And this is something that like humans don't know, but I believe we could actually use AI tools to figure out different things about people's inner psychology and their subconscious.
Yeah, and for those who might be skeptical of this, I'll just tell you that there are new credit scoring models that are coming about to replace the old FICO scoring model that we've been using for so long, where they're looking at about 1,000 data points. And they're literally looking at things to the extent of, they have noticed by studying this, that people who write on a written credit application, like for a credit card, right? If they write in all caps, they're more likely to default. Where if they write in upper lowercase, they're less likely to default. And this has been studied and proven over huge sample sizes. And there are many other examples of this. So it's pretty interesting stuff. It really is.
A great classic example is there's a tech survey company by the name of Qualtrics that found out, 6 or 7 years ago that your voting preferences correlated to your soda pop preferences.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's like, what do the two have to do with each other? It's kind of like modern day astrology now, where it's like, I don't know what really the two have to do with each other, but we're seeing correlations and they might not actually be causal. Mm-hmm. But if we layer enough on top with each other, then we're going to likely be able to predict a number of interesting things. And that's one of the really scary, crazy, very fascinating things in the world of AI is we're discovering a lot of things that like we don't really have a very clear answer or understanding of why it is the way it is, but it's showing interesting things and it's showing very interesting trends. And I'm very interested in seeing how we could use some of these tools, not just for logistical purposes or for creating things or for managing things or for scheduling our day, but to actually understand more the human psyche and what that means on a collective level. So one way this really ties to culture is it's a lot easier to analyze big trends when it comes to large groups of people than when it comes to small groups of people. In theory, you could scrape a lot of data from LinkedIn. You could analyze, people's language choice, and you could predict, before the next quarterly earnings, what the sentiment is or the mood is of that particular company. And, if I were running a hedge fund, I would do that, instead of just following the fundamental analysis or even the technical analysis, because I'd be able to tell, okay, well, we might see, we're probably going to see these quarterly earnings report, or we're going to see this 10K or these financial statements 2 months from now. But right now, we could maybe analyze the employees' social media data and figure out what are they feeling right now. And then, the assumption is you're able to predict things before anyone else does.
Yeah, I mean, a CEO speech, what they said or their tone on an earnings call, there's a lot of clues, aren't there? But I think people view this as a very soft science, right? There's a lot of room for interpretation probably, and I don't think anyone's really betting their money on it yet. Are they? Or are they?
I'm trying to find people that are, and I'm essentially a prophet, essentially claiming that all these things that we consider to be very, very, very soft sciences can actually be quantified in the most very, very, very analytical of ways. And the easiest way to do it without too much processing power for a computer is through language choice. There's other ways you could do it. You could use visual spatial, like visual motion recognition, but that requires a lot of processing power. So another thing that AI can do is not just analyze people's language, but also analyze people's microexpressions. So how people move their lips, their eyes, their face, their cheeks, their forehead.
Yeah. And maybe we've all seen that show. I can't think of the name of that show where, the guy would use microexpressions to analyze whether someone was lying or not. What's the name of the show? Lie to Me, yeah.
Yes, so that's based off the work and life of Paul Ekman. I'm also a very serious student of his work. He showed that all the different emotions are actually universal, and you could analyze and read people very, very quickly by assessing their microexpressions. So, for example, you, Jason.
I'm becoming self-conscious.
You're becoming self-conscious now. Like you've presented a lot of different microexpressions to indicate that you have a high level of conscientiousness, you're very dutiful, you're very focused, you're very careful, and maybe in a previous life you would have been pretty good at counting. So that's essentially, if an AI were to view that way, and I was just doing very basic, very surface level analysis, but that's the kind of thing an AI program could be trained to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no question about it. So AI could analyze videos and maybe be better than a polygraph, maybe better than an fMRI. Like the fMRI has got to be the ultimate lie detector, right? Or mind reader, whatever purpose you want to use it for, because you can't fool that, right?
You can. And really what I want this to do is, there's always going to be Enrons out there. There's always going to be companies that are going to fail, or there's going to be CEOs that have their own narcissistic ambitions or their own Machiavellian machinations out there. And there's always going to be something where someone produced something and maybe it's not exactly truthful, or someone might have some agenda. And I would want to be able to read behind the lines, and I would want to invest in a company that is so insanely unethical that I know it's going to fail.
Yeah.
And I think there's real use cases for this in financial situations, in legal situations, and when it comes to mass media as well.
How should people use this in their own lives? I mean, someone's watching this video, they're listening to us talking on a podcast. What can they do with this kind of information?
So this is something that you bring up a number of very interesting ethical points. One is, to what extent should this kind of technology be spread to the masses? And how can you prove yourself worthy enough at the maturity level to use this? Personally, I wouldn't want to use this kind of technology towards someone I know. There's a lot of things I don't necessarily want to know about someone. I don't want to appear that over breaching people's privacy. I always know there has to be some kind of distance in some layer where there has to be a level where I am removed from that particular person. And what we have to do is figure out, okay, well, if something is in public, maybe that's a different situation, or where someone is a leader and they are making a public performance, that's the case. And, maybe we could eventually have a day and age where there could be something like a ChatGPT or a Bard AI, but its whole purpose is focused on analyzing people's psychology, their attitudes, their behavior. I think what this is going to do, one way or another, Jason, is that I believe there's probably going to be a renewed interest in privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And that means people are going to be much more careful what they post, what they put out on the internet, what people are going to do, because it's not the same.
And Facebook has already been exposed for analyzing people's posts and using that to pigeonhole them into, we are living in 1984.
And one of the arguments I kind of have is, I'm not quite sure if it would work this way, but what would happen if an individual had the same power that, the state had? So what would it be like? So through much of history, like let's say people have made this an argument about the Second Amendment. It's like, oh, okay, well, the government has the right to violence. And what would it be like if the citizens also had the right to violence? Because they were able to own guns, or they were able to defend themselves, or they were able to form private militias. Now, this is kind of the same thing when, in this day and age, it's the government that is very much in control of words. They're very much in control of speech, which, a lot of people, it's very, very debatable, but a lot of people will say, oh, speech is violence. But the fact of the matter is that in whatever reality we're living in right now, it's the government that's controlling the information. It's the government that's controlling espionage. It's the government that's controlling, what information, what technology that we're able to see and able to look on to other people. And what would happen if the people had that same level of information? Here's another great analogy.
By the way, before you go on, you reminded me of something that I think is important. It's reminiscent of a great book that I read years ago, and I've talked about often, by the late Alvin Toffler, called Power Shift. And in it, he chronicles the three forms of power throughout history, right? First, the ability to inflict violence. That was the first form of power, right? The second form was the ability to use capital. And then the third and highest grade form of power was information, right? Ayn Rand argued that the government has to have the monopoly on the ability to inflict violence. We can't have a bunch of vigilantes running around inflicting violence, right? We have to sort of relegate that to government, okay? And, she wasn't much in favor of too much government. So for her to say that was, I thought,
it's a very,
rational.
Very good. If the government didn't have the power, then it would be sheer anarchy.
Right.
It would be very
well, if the government wasn't the only one with the power, right? The government is the only one with the legal power to inflict violence, right? So, but the interesting thing about information is that the same piece of information can be used by both sides, right? And that's why I think information, unlike the ability to inflict violence, should be free and open, right? And the people should have, except I guess you're going to have to make exceptions for certain things, but pretty much all the information, right? And if we look at that during the era of the pandemic we just went through, and, the way Dr. F, I'll call him because we'll be censored, okay? He wasn't sharing the real information. And now we're seeing that, that's all being slowly exposed. And we're seeing, what these big pharma companies were doing and so forth. And I think a lot more of that's going to come out, fortunately. But can you imagine if the people had access to the information at the same time, or in almost real time, that the government had access to the information?
It would be very, very different. And this is something that I remember reading in 2020. I don't know if it's true, but I believe it very well could be, is that in the year 2020, the average person on Earth had the same access to information, or the ability to access the same total amount of information as Bill Clinton did in 1994.
Yeah, and I've heard that too. It's not that the average person, it's the person with a old cell phone, not a super smartphone like we have now, but an old cell phone had more information than the president did, just several years earlier. So that is true, but of course there's still a lot of information they're keeping from us.
There is, unfortunately, there's a big, huge push to, in many ways, make the internet less user-friendly, less reliable. Yeah. We've seen a big, huge push in the last 5 years, especially 3 years, where it's harder to search things. It's harder to find things. You used to get hundreds of thousands of Google results that were accurate, that were timely, that were very relevant. And I think a combination of censorship movements, ads, also AI development, and a number of other little things altogether have made the internet much less easy place, much less open place and effective than it was even 3 years ago.
Yeah. January 6th changed a lot of it. And I think the good thing that came out of that is that now anybody with a brain does not trust the government or the big tech companies, thankfully. And they do not deserve our trust at all. In fact, they're the antitrust. Okay. I mean, well, that's what they need to be done, is busted up under antitrust. Because what's happening is the government can't do a lot of the things they can. The government would be violating your civil rights if they restricted your speech and so forth. But they're just using the big tech companies as a proxy to do that, right? And so when they exchange favors and the lobbyists are lobbying the congressman, they're just horse trading there in terms of ways to censor, because they can't do it themselves. So they have to delegate it to these private companies. And so it's a very bad situation we're in. And the recent Supreme Court decisions just last week or the week before on the Communications Decency Act, known as the CDA, Section 230, they ruled in favor of the tech companies and in favor of censorship and in favor of them running roughshod over the people. And it's a very sad situation.
It's very, very unfortunate, because when we live in an age of censorship, if we don't have access to free and open information, then there is going to be misinformation. There is going to be, in reality, it's an attack on human progress, real human progress, innovation, technology. And I don't know if they're realizing this, but it's very scary, because if this goes too far, it could throw us back into a mini dark age. Really, it could lead to civilizational decline. And I don't think that's a hyperbolic statement really at all. If we are able to erase our past, if we're able to essentially get rid of a functioning internet, and if we don't actually have a lot of hard physical records, which we don't really have much from the last 20 or 30 years,
right,
then we do have the possibility of some kind of systems break.
No, they've created a memory hole already. They're continuing to create memory holes for the population. It really is Orwellian. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's very much in line with what Orwell predicted in the late 40s. So we'll see where it goes. But again, I want to kind of tie this back in if we can, because we could go on forever about this, and it's a good topic. It's an important topic for sure. But just tie it back into how people can use this in their own life. What is the language and the self-talk they're using, that keeps them from opportunities or keeps them from good investments? Language obviously impacts the culture, right? And you talked about how the language from 30 years ago is so different than it is today. So maybe you want to touch on that, but also our own self-talk, right? What we're saying to ourselves either creates a world of opportunity or a world of scarcity or somewhere in between, right?
So the number one trend I've noticed, you brought up how language is changing over the last 30 years, and that is we are losing very, very, very quickly many of the traits that have made us distinctly American. So things that deal with sovereignty, that deal with individualism, that deal with our want of privacy, our desire for meritocracy, our desire to achieve, when it comes to having strong convictions, a high level of certainty, a strong level of legacy, knowing where we're coming from. There's a lot of traits like this that are really, really under attack. And, among younger generations, you actually see them much, much less than older generations. And what this really implies is that, over the next coming decades, this might already be set in stone. I believe it's probably impossible to change at this point. But the culture of the United States is shifting to becoming more similar to most of the global South. So really what we're seeing is maybe more of the Miamification or Brazilification of the United States. Here's a great example of that. So imagine a very waspy culture in Connecticut that might extend to places like Minnesota or Washington. You could imagine the values of, a lot of people talk about whiteness. And when a lot of people criticize whiteness, they're actually talking about very traditional American cultural traits. So the reality is we're going to see a lot less of that. So that means we're going to be a lot less focused on time. We're going to be a lot less focused on money. We're going to be a lot less focused on operations, on managing things. Right now, I actually think we're at a peak level of bureaucracy. And I think a lot of systems are probably just going to disintegrate or fall apart. Mm-hmm. So chances are that there's going to be a strong amount of new tribal formations when it comes to the overall culture of the United States. So, and you see that in California, you see that in South Florida, where people, are going to kind of disregard the state at large and overall mainstream culture and just care about like the group that they belong to.
Yeah. So they're going to think smaller. They're going to think where they have a nexus of control or input. Then the folks at the top levels are just going to do whatever they want and roll over.
Divide and conquer. But one of the things, though, is if that level of corruption continues, the overall efficacy of what's happening at the bottom will essentially trace itself up to the top. Like they will be impacted. And I don't know if, the people who are more above the managerial class or the technocrats or the elites, whatever you want to call them, I don't know if they realize this, because what they're doing, I actually think they're shooting themselves in the foot, because what they're doing, they might get a larger piece of the pie, but very, very, very rapidly, the pie is going to get much, much, much smaller.
That's what always happens under collectivism, socialism, and communism. It's the pie redistributes, but the pie overall gets smaller because incentives are taken away. It's an unfortunate situation.
It's happened before many, 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 many times the world over.
It sure has. It sure has. You have some good resources on your website, and I believe they're free, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, they are still currently free for the time being. I've actually been tempted to put a paywall, but for the time being, they are free. So I have a website called personabilities.com. That's one word, personabilities. And on there, there's actually 4 different assessments. One is a cultural assessment dealing with your personal values, your beliefs, how you understand the world and communicate with others. Another one is what I have termed an intelligence type assessment. So that deals with your professional abilities. I'm not looking at the level of your intelligence. It's not like an IQ test. It's actually looking at the range of your intelligence or the type of intelligence that you have. Then I have a test that deals with your temperament, your personal behavior, your dispositions, your vibes, how you come across others. And then a last one dealing with neurology, or how you process your thoughts and how you digest information. Each one takes about 10 to 12 minutes to take, and you get your own free report afterwards.
Excellent. Good stuff. Well, Daniel, thanks for joining us. We should have you back, and let's pick a topic. I mean, your stuff is so broad. Let's pick a topic and go deep on it in the future on another show. But this was a great overview, and we covered a lot of ground. So check out his website, personabilities.com, for those free assessment tools. And Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.